At gate 22, Roderick cut his wife's passport in half and announced he was taking another woman to Paris instead. The crowd braced for tears. Folak gave them none. She stood perfectly still, watching him the way a woman watches a man dig his own grave, because what she'd done the week before, nobody in that terminal knew. The terminal smelled like burnt coffee and cold, conditioned air, and the gray morning light through the tall glass made everyone in it look tired except Roderick. He stood in a navy coat that had cost more than 3 months of rent on the first apartment they had ever shared, holding the two halves of her torn passport up in the air like a man holding the proof of his own importance. Travelers slowed as they passed. A boy tugged his mother's sleeve and pointed before she pulled his hand down. An airline agent froze with a boarding scanner half raised, and in the middle of all of it stood Folak, her purse pressed lightly against her side, her chin level, her shoulders loose, her dark eyes resting on the face of the man she had married 11 years before. She did not blink. She did not step back. She only watched him, the way you might watch weather rolling in from a long way off, knowing exactly how much time you have before it breaks. Beside Roderick stood Simone, younger, taller, wrapped in a white dress as though she were already somewhere warm and far from this cold terminal. She did not look embarrassed to be there. She looked entertained. She let one manicured hand rest lightly on Roderick's forearm and tilted her head toward Folak, the way people tilt their heads at something broken on the side of the road, something that is sad for a second before you drive on past it. When Roderick said the word Paris, loud and proud, Simone's smile spread wider across her face, slow and deliberate. She wanted Folak to see it. That smile said more than any insult Roderick could have shouted across the crowded gate, and she knew it. And she let it sit there in the air between the three of them, like a thing she had been waiting a long time to show. It was the smile of a woman who believed she had already won everything that mattered. "You really thought you were coming," Roderick said, loud enough that the families in the next row of seats went quiet to listen. "Look at you. Just look at you. You don't fit a city like Paris. You never fit anything I built. Not once. Not the houses, not the dinners, not the life. Boring. That's the word for you. That's the only word. You bored me for 11 years, and I am done being bored." He let the torn halves of the passport fall from his fingers and flutter down onto the cold tile at her feet, and then he folded his arms and waited. He waited for the sobbing he was certain would come, because in his mind it had always come, and the sound of her crying had always been, to him, the sound of himself winning an argument he had never really been having. He had rehearsed this morning in his head for weeks, and in every version of it she fell apart in front of the strangers, and he walked away clean and free, the wronged man finally released. He had counted on her tears the way a man counts on the sun coming up. He had never once, in all his planning, considered what it might mean if they simply did not arrive. But Folak did not sob. She bent down slowly, knees together, back straight, and gathered the two pieces of the ruined passport from the floor with the unhurried care of a woman picking up something precious rather than something destroyed. She did not press them to her chest. She did not let her hands shake, not even slightly, though the whole crowd was watching her hands now, waiting for the tremble that would tell them she was breaking. It never came. She slid the torn halves into the worn leather travel journal her mother had given her years before, the one with the soft, cracked cover and the ribbon faded almost to white. And she closed it with a single, quiet sound that somehow carried across the entire gate. Then she straightened, and she looked up at her husband. And for the first time that whole morning, Roderick felt something move through him that he could not name and did not like. A woman nearby leaned and whispered something to her husband behind her hand. The airline agent still had not lowered the scanner. Every stranger in that small gathered crowd had braced for a scene, the kind of public collapse that people pretend not to film while their phones come out of their pockets anyway. What they got instead was silence, and the silence of a publicly humiliated woman who refuses to weep is the most unsettling sound in the world, because the mind cannot make sense of it. Roderick's jaw tightened until the muscles stood out along it. Simone's wide smile thinned by a single degree, just enough for someone watching closely to catch. And Folake simply stood there, holding her mother's journal against her purse, breathing slow and even, waiting with the patience of a woman who already knew something that not one person in that terminal had even begun to guess. To understand why she did not break that morning, you have to go all the way back to a small kitchen in a small apartment, where a much younger Roderick once stood barefoot on cracked linoleum with flour up to his elbows, laughing at himself because he had tried to surprise her with homemade bread and burned the whole loaf black as coal. They had almost nothing in those days. He sold phone plans at a kiosk in the middle of a shopping mall, calling out to strangers who walked past him without slowing. She kept the books for a hair salon and a corner pharmacy, counting other people's money with a patience and a precision that she would one day wish, with her whole heart, she had spent more carefully on her own life instead of everyone else's. But she did not know that yet. Back then, she only knew that the burned bread made them both laugh until they cried, and that laughter felt like wealth. In those early years, the leather journal was not evidence of anything. It was a book of dreams. They filled its pages together on quiet Sunday nights at the kitchen table, 2 cups of cheap tea between them, listing all the cities they would visit when the money finally came. Lagos first, he always said, to walk her through the streets where his people came from. Then Accra. Then, always written at the very top of her own list in her small, careful handwriting, the word Paris, underlined twice, because her mother had cleaned office buildings for 30 years and had told her more than once, with fierce certainty, that one day a daughter of hers would stand somewhere beautiful in the world and know in her bones that she belonged there. Roderick used to lean over and kiss the top of that page where the word was written. She remembered the feel of that. She would remember it again at the very worst possible moment of her life. The money did come, slowly at first, and then all at once, the way water finds a crack and then floods through it. Roderick had a real gift for talking, and the talking turned into a small logistics company, and the small company turned into a true one, with trucks and warehouses and signed contracts, and a business partner named Tundo, who wore expensive shoes and smiled with every tooth in his head. Folake had been there the very night the partnership was signed, had poured the drinks herself, had laughed at Tunda's jokes. Over the years, he had called her sister at family dinners, had eaten the food from her kitchen more times than she could count, had stood in the hospital hallway and held their newborn nephew in his arms, with tears in his eyes. She trusted him the way a person trusts the foundation of the house they live in, which is to say she did not think about him at all. He was simply part of the ground she stood on. The first change was small, the way the first hairline crack in a wall is small and easy to paint over. Roderick began turning his phone face down on the dinner table, a thing he had never done before in all their years. Then came the late nights, explained away every time with a single word, the word Tunde, as if the name alone were an alibi that needed no further detail. Money began moving in ways she no longer recognized. Accounts she had once balanced to the penny were quietly closed to her. A new banker called the house and asked only for Roderick, never for her, and grew flustered when she answered. She noticed each of these things, and she said nothing about any of them, because she had learned somewhere along the way that a quiet question keeps far longer than a loud one, and ripens better. Instead, she wrote small notes in the margins of the journal, dates and amounts, in handwriting too neat and too steady to ever look like fear. There were nights she lay awake in the dark beside him, listening to him breathe, and told herself firmly that she was imagining all of it, that a good wife did not go looking for shadows in her own marriage. There were mornings he kissed her forehead on his way out the door, and she almost let herself believe that the old life was still there, just underneath the new one, waiting to come back. But a woman who once counted other people's money for a living knows, deep in her hands, the particular feeling of numbers that refuse to add up no matter how many times you run them. And the numbers in her own home had stopped adding up a long time ago. She did not yet know the full shape of the betrayal that was growing around her. She only knew with certainty that it had a shape, that it was real, and that it was getting larger every single week she chose to stay quiet. The confirmation came on an ordinary Tuesday, the kind of plain gray day that splits a person's whole life cleanly into a before and an after, without ever once asking permission. Roderick was away at a meeting he had described to her in far too much detail that morning, and she had learned by then that too much detail was exactly how he lied, that the truth from him was always short, and the lies always came dressed up in scenery. She went into his home office only to look for the spare key to her own car, nothing more than that. And she found instead a thin manila folder sitting in a drawer that was almost always locked, and that day, through the small accident of his growing carelessness, simply was not. She stood there with her hand on the drawer for a long moment before she opened it the rest of the way. Some part of her already knew, the way you know a phone is about to ring a half-second before it does, that whatever was inside that folder would not let her go back to the life she had been living that morning. She could have closed the drawer. She thought about it. She thought about the years she had spent not looking, all the small mercies of not knowing, and then she pulled it open anyway, because a woman who has spent her life counting other people's numbers cannot, in the end, leave her own unread. She lowered herself into his leather chair and read the documents through once, and then a second time, because the first time her mind had simply refused to accept the meaning of the words on the page. Their home, the house she had decorated slowly and lovingly, room by room, over 11 years, had been pledged as collateral. Her mother's inheritance, the small and hard-won inheritance that was the only thing the woman had ever managed to leave behind in this world, had been pledged right along with it. All of it tied to a business loan she had never once heard mentioned, for a deal she had never been asked to approve, with a signature sitting on the bottom line that was almost hers, but not quite. A forgery careful enough to fool any stranger at a bank, and clumsy enough in its small wrong loops to wound the wife whose name it stole. She sat very still and read it a third time, but it was the second signature on the page that stopped the breath in her chest entirely. There, beside Roderick's name, witnessing it and co-signing it and binding himself fully to the whole arrangement, was Tunde. and clipped neatly behind the loan documents was a separate page, a quiet little side agreement, a contract that promised Tunda a generous share of everything if and when the marriage assets were ever liquidated. Not the company's assets, the marriages, the home, her mother's money, the life she had built with her own 2 hands. 2 men had sat together in some comfortable office and calmly put a price on the ending of her marriage, had written it down and signed it, and one of those 2 men had held her infant nephew in his arms in a hospital hallway and called her his sister at her own dinner table while he did it. She read his name again, the looping, confident signature she had seen 100 times on birthday cards and holiday notes, and she felt the whole shape of her life quietly rearrange itself around it. The man she had fed, the man she had defended when others doubted him. He had not been a witness to the theft. He had helped design it. That was the second wound, and it cut far deeper than the first one had. A husband's betrayal she could almost find a way to understand, because she had watched it grow slowly for years, like a season changing, and there had been time to brace for it. But Tunda had been family. Tunda had eaten the food she cooked with her own hands. The discovery that the betrayal had 2 authors instead of 1 rearranged something deep inside her, quietly and permanently. The way a key turns in a lock you never knew was hidden in the wall. She did not cry in that leather chair. She did not scream or sweep the papers to the floor. Instead, she grew still, the way deep water grows still on the surface while everything underneath keeps moving. And there, in the quiet of his office, she began, for the very first time in all of this, to truly think. She did not confront him. That single choice was the one that changed absolutely everything. The choice that the strangers at Gate 22 would never be able to understand, because all they would ever see was the ending and never the long, patient road that led to it. She closed the manila folder carefully and placed it back in the drawer exactly as she had found it, every edge lined up the way he had left it. Then she walked the 3 blocks to the copy shop near the salon, the one with the tired old machine and the bored teenager slouched behind the counter, and she quietly photocopied every single page. She pressed the warm copies flat inside her mother's leather journal, tucking them between the old dream pages and the careful margin notes. And she walked home through the afternoon with the whole truth folded gently against the oldest hope she had ever owned. Here is the question she carried home with her that day, the question that would hang in the air over this entire story and refuse to be answered for a very long time. What does a careful, quiet woman actually do with the proof that her husband and the man she had trusted as a brother have already sold the very ground beneath her feet? Standing in her own kitchen that evening, she did not yet know the answer herself. She only knew, with a strange and growing certainty, that the photocopies pressed inside the journal were not a weapon. Not yet. They were a seed, small and folded, and full of something not yet grown. And if there was one thing this woman had always understood, one thing her mother's whole life had taught her, it was how to be patient with growing things, and how to wait without ever once looking like she was waiting. The next morning, she made his coffee exactly the way she always had, 2 sugars and a splash of milk stirred in slow, and she set it down in front of him and watched him drink it and scroll through his phone and tell her all about a meeting that she now knew for a fact did not exist. She felt no anger in that moment, and the absence of it frightened her far more than rage ever could have. What she felt instead was a cold and total clarity, the clarity of a woman who has finally stopped hoping and quietly started planning. When the door closed behind him and his car pulled away, She opened the leather journal at the kitchen table, looked for a long moment at her mother's faded handwriting sitting beside her own, and then she turned to a clean page and began to make a list that had nothing at all to do with cities. The first name she wrote on that list was a lawyer, a woman named Adez, who worked out of a modest office above a bakery and carried a quiet reputation for being almost impossible to beat once she took a case. Folak went to her not as a wife in tears, not as someone seeking comfort, but as a client carrying a folder, and she laid the photocopies down on the wide desk and said only 6 words. "I need to know what's real." A Daisy read through the pages in complete silence for a long time, her face giving nothing away, turning each sheet over with one careful finger. When she finally looked up, her expression had changed into the careful, respectful look of a person who has just realized that the quiet woman sitting across the desk from her is far, far stronger than her circumstances would ever suggest, and a great deal more dangerous to the right people. Over the weeks that followed, Folak built her case the same patient way she had once built their whole life together, brick by brick, and without any applause. A handwriting examiner studied the loan and confirmed in clean written language what her own eyes had already known, that the signature binding away her home was not hers and never had been. The bank's own fraud office quietly opened a file. Adaizi prepared the legal documents that would freeze every relevant account the very moment they were filed, and she explained carefully to Folak that, in a matter like this one, timing was the whole game, that the strongest possible move was never the loudest one, but the one made in perfect silence at the exact instant the other side was certain it had already won. Folak understood that better than anyone Adaizi had ever represented. She had been quietly underestimated by someone or other for her entire life. She kept the original documents locked in a safe deposit box at the bank, and she kept the photocopies pressed inside the journal, and she carried that journal with her everywhere she went, because there is a particular and unbreakable strength in keeping your proof close against your own heart. Roderick, for his part, noticed absolutely nothing. He had grown careless in the specific way of men who have decided the game is already over and the trophy already theirs. He spoke openly on the phone now, leaving doors ajar. He left receipts crumpled in his coat pockets. He booked an entire trip to Paris and did not even take the small trouble to hide the second ticket, because in his mind, the woman he had married was already gone from his life, already beaten, already nothing more than furniture he fully intended to leave behind in a house he believed was his. And here is the thing the audience now understands that Roderick, in all his confidence, did not. While he stood planning the details of his great triumph, his quiet wife had already finished building the trap, and she had built the entire thing out of his own carelessness, brick by careless brick, using nothing but the doors he left open and the papers he left lying around. He believed with his whole chest that he was the one choosing the moment, choosing the time and the place and the manner of her humiliation. He was only walking, step by confident step, toward the exact moment she had already prepared for him. And the question from the office still hung there in the air above all of it, unanswered and waiting. What would she finally do with those copies? She was about to show him, but not yet, and the not yet was the most dangerous part of the whole thing. 3 nights before the flight to Paris, Roderick threw a large dinner to celebrate what he kept loudly calling his expansion, a long, crowded table full of partners and acquaintances, and the kind of people who mattered to him in the only way anyone ever mattered to him, which was usefully. Folake arrived in a dress of deep forest green, calm and gracious and entirely composed, and she moved through the room, greeting every single guest warmly and by name. She did not look in any way like a woman who had recently been replaced and discarded. She looked instead like a woman who quietly owned the entire room and had simply, graciously, chosen not to mention the fact to anyone. And a few of the sharper guests at that table, the ones who paid attention to such things, began without quite understanding why to watch her instead of the loud man at the head of it. Tunda was there, of course, sitting comfortable and easy at Roderick's right hand, laughing too loudly at his own jokes, already spending in his mind money that was not yet his to spend. Folake crossed the crowded room to him with a warm and open smile, leaned in close as though sharing a happy secret, and asked him one single quiet question about the financing structure of the New Deal. A question worded so precisely and so exactly that only a person who had personally read the hidden documents could possibly have known to ask it. Tunde's easy laugh caught hard in his throat. His eyes flicked sideways to Roderick and then quickly back to her face, searching it. He answered her badly, stumbling over numbers a man in his position should have known. Cold, and in that one small public stumble, the entire balance of the evening tipped, quietly, a fraction of an inch in a new direction. Roderick felt that shift happen without understanding the first thing about it. He watched his wife move through his guests with an easy grace he had not seen in her for years and could not begin to account for now. And something in his chest pulled tight, the same nameless tightening he would feel again at the airport before the airport had even happened. Simone was not at this particular dinner. This was a night reserved strictly for the people who mattered to him. And that fact, too, Folake quietly noted and filed away, because it told her in plain language exactly how low he ranked the woman in the white dress, exactly how disposable Simone would prove to be, the moment she stopped being convenient. She tucked the observation away with all the others, and she smiled, and she leaned across the table to pour wine for a man as steadily as if her hands had never once trembled in her entire life. Later in the evening, when the crowd had finally thinned and the candles had burned low, Simone arrived after all, late and bright and absolutely certain of her welcome in that house. She found Folake standing alone near the tall window with a glass in her hand, and she could not resist the moment. "It must be so hard," she said softly, sweetly, smiling the whole time, "having to stand here and watch all of this just slip away from you." Folake turned and looked at her for a long, quiet moment, taking in the youth and the easy confidence and the bright white dress, and what rose up in her was something close to pity. "Nothing," she said gently, "is slipping away from me." And she said it with such complete and settled certainty that Simone's practiced smile faltered and slipped, and for the first time, the younger woman walked away, genuinely unsure which of the two of them was actually losing. That was the power shift, though not one single person in that crowded house could have named it, if you had asked them. It was not a confrontation. No voice was raised. It was only a change in the air itself, the precise moment a strong current quietly reverses direction beneath a surface that still looks perfectly calm. The sharper guests felt it pass through the room and could not have told you why. Tunde felt it move through him and reached, a little too quickly, for another drink. Roderick felt it most of all and told himself firmly that it was nothing at all, that his wife was simply putting on a brave public face, that in 3 short days he would be standing in Paris, and every bit of this would be far behind him. He was entirely right that all of it would soon be behind him. He was only fatally wrong about what the word everything was going to mean. And so we arrive once more at Gate 22, back where this whole story first began, except that now you can finally see the entire shape of it, the way you can at last see the true shape of a darkened room the moment someone reaches over and turns on the light. Roderick stood there with the torn passport scattered at his feet and his bright mistress at his side, fully certain in his bones that he was delivering the final, crushing blow to a woman who had no answer for it. He did not know, could not even imagine, that his wife had carefully chosen this exact place, this exact public audience, this exact unremarkable morning. He believed with everything in him that he had set the stage for her ruin. In truth, he had only walked, willingly and proudly, right onto the center of hers. Every cruel word he had chosen for that morning, every stranger he had gathered as an audience to her shame, every piece of the scene he thought he was directing, she had quietly accounted for in advance. He had picked the airport because it was public. He did not understand yet that public was exactly what she had wanted all along, that the size of the crowd he summoned to watch her fall was about to become the size of the crowd that watched him. Folake opened her mother's worn leather journal there in front of the whole gathered crowd, and from between its soft and faded pages she drew out the photocopies, slowly and without the slightest hurry, exactly as though she had all the time in the entire world and not a single thing left to fear. She did not raise her voice, not even slightly. She laid the pages down on the airline counter one at a time, smoothing each one flat beneath her palm with great care, lining up their edges, taking her time. And then she began to speak in a tone so low and so quiet that the people around her actually leaned their bodies in toward her to catch the words, which is the only kind of quiet in this world that can truly silence a noisy crowd, the kind people are afraid of missing. The journal sat open on the counter beside the pages, its faded ribbon hanging loose over the edge. The same small book that had once held nothing but the names of cities they would never see together. Now it held the proof. She rested 2 fingers on its worn cover for a moment, the way a person rests a hand on something that has carried them a long way. And then she let the pages do the rest. "This is a loan taken out against our home," she said, placing the first page flat on the counter. "I never signed it. The signature is forged, and a handwriting examiner has already confirmed that in writing with his name on it." She laid down the second page beside the first. "This one pledges my mother's entire inheritance as collateral against that loan. My mother cleaned office buildings for 30 years to leave that money behind." She laid down the third page, slowly, and then she lifted her steady eyes from the counter and found Roderick's face across the small space between them. "And this is the private agreement that pays your partner a full share of everything we own the very moment our marriage is dissolved. You did not simply plan to leave me, Roderick. You sold me, and Tundi signed his own name to the sale." She let the last word settle, and she did not look away from his face, and she did not blink, exactly as she had not blinked when he held the torn passport in the air a few minutes before. The whole of their 11 years seemed to hang in the space between them, and she let him feel every year of it before she spoke again. The entire terminal went completely and utterly silent. Not the ordinary low quiet of a public place between announcements, but the deep, total, ringing silence of dozens of strangers who have all at once understood that they are standing witness to something true and terrible. Simone's manicured hand slid slowly off of Roderick's forearm and fell to her side. A businessman who had been filming lowered his phone without thinking. Somewhere down the row, a small child's voice piped up with a question and was instantly, gently hushed. Roderick opened his mouth to speak and found that there was absolutely nothing inside it to say, because there exists no argument in the world a man can make against his own signature. Read calmly aloud, in public, by the very woman he had spent years trying so hard to erase from his life. He looked from the pages to her face and back to the pages again, and for the first time, the loud confidence that had carried him through every room he had ever entered simply was not there to reach for. The crowd was no longer waiting for her to break. They were watching him, and he could feel the exact moment their eyes changed. The accounts were all frozen this morning, Folake continued, her voice never once rising, never once cracking or catching. Before you ever arrived here. The trip you so proudly booked was paid for out of money that is now the center of an active fraud investigation, which means those tickets in your coat pocket are worth even less than the passport you just cut in half and threw at my feet. I did not come to this airport to fly anywhere with you. I came here to watch you find out, in the one place public enough that you could never afterward pretend it away or talk your way out of it. She closed the leather journal with that same soft, final sound. I photocopied every page the week before you ever thought to celebrate. That is the thing you did not know. And there it was at last. The answer to the question that had hung in the air since that gray Tuesday in the office, resolved finally and fully out in the open air of a crowded airport gate. The photocopies had never once been the weapon. They had only ever been the insurance. The original documents were already filed, already in motion, already working quietly inside the machinery of the bank and the court, already far beyond the reach of any charm or smile he had ever used to talk his way out of a consequence in his life. Roderick understood the whole of it all at once, in a single, sickening rush, the way a man understands the ground is gone only in the instant after he has already stepped off the edge of it, and every last trace of certainty drained slowly out of his face and left it empty. Tunde himself was not standing at the gate that morning, but he learned of everything that had happened there within the hour, because rooms like that one always leak, and news like that always travels fast. And by that same afternoon, his frantic calls to Roderick were going unanswered in both directions at once. Each man had, in a single morning, become a mortal danger to the other. The thing they had built together, the brotherhood and the scheme both, had only ever held together as long as it stayed hidden, and now that it stood naked in the daylight, each of them could see exactly how much the other one could cost him. And Simone simply left the terminal without a single word to anyone, walking fast and stiff on her bright white heels toward a future that no longer had any room in it for a wealthy man, because the precise moment the money turned from a glittering prize into a criminal investigation, her interest in Roderick expired as cleanly and as completely as a parking meter running out on an empty street. In the weeks that followed that morning, the entire structure that Roderick had so proudly built came apart slowly along the very seams that he himself had cut into it. The fraud investigation froze, first his personal accounts, and then the company's, and the signed contracts that had been his pride evaporated one after another, the way contracts always do. The moment a man's name quietly becomes a question instead of a promise. Partners who had stood and raised their glasses to toast his expansion stopped returning his calls entirely. The bank moved to recover everything it could reach, and the home that had been pledged away without Photocopied's true and willing signature became the center of a long legal fight in which that very forgery, in a turn he never saw coming, became the single strongest weapon she had to win it all back. Tunde, exposed by the same set of documents that had been meant to make him a wealthy man, tried first to lay all the blame onto Roderick, and then, when that failed, to simply vanish. And in the end, he managed to do neither one. The quiet side agreement that was supposed to enrich him became instead the clearest piece of evidence that made him liable for all of it. And the long brotherhood the two men had built together on the foundation of Photocopied's trust collapsed into a bitter pile of accusations, each man pointing a shaking finger at the other across the smoking ruins of a scheme that had counted, from the very beginning, on one thing and one thing only: a quiet wife staying quiet. Photocopied pursued none of it herself. She did not need to lift a finger. She had simply told the plain truth in the right place at the right moment, and let their own arrangement finish the rest of the work for her. She never once raised her voice through any single part of it. Not in the lawyer's office above the bakery, not in the cold halls of the bank, not even in the one brief hearing she was finally required by the court to attend in person. When people who knew her story asked her how on earth she had managed to stay so perfectly calm through all of it, she never explained to them that calm had simply been the only weapon she could afford to carry for a very long and lonely time, and that she had learned to hold on to it the exact way her mother had once learned to hold a mop and a dream in the same two tired hands at the same time, without ever dropping either one of them. She let the people think it was coldness. It was never coldness. It was the quiet dignity of a woman who had decided, long before that morning at the gate, that she would not become the wreckage everyone around her expected her to become. Months and months later, on a narrow, cobbled street in a city very far from that cold terminal, a woman sat at a small, round iron table outside a cafe, with the soft gold of late afternoon light resting warm on her face and her mother's worn leather journal lying open on the table in front of her. The torn pieces of the old passport were long gone now, replaced months ago by a new one in her own name. And there, pressed flat between the very pages where the photocopies had once been hidden, sat a single plane ticket made out in her name and her name alone. And beside it, a fresh, clean page on which she had written, in the same small and careful hand, her mother would have recognized anywhere in the world, just 4 short words: "I belong here too." She closed the leather journal gently and lifted her eyes to look up at the pale stone buildings all around her, and the wide gray-gold evening sky stretched out above them. And she found, to her own quiet surprise, that she was not thinking about Roderick at all, which was itself a kind of freedom, the rarest kind, the kind that arrives so softly and so completely that you very nearly miss the moment it finally comes. Some people will cut up everything they believe to be your entire world and throw the pieces at your feet, never once imagining that you kept a careful copy of it somewhere safe, somewhere close against your heart, somewhere they were always far too arrogant to think to look. If the quiet of this one woman taught you something tonight, then carry it out of here with you, and stay a while for the next story of someone who chose dignity over noise, who waited without breaking, and who, in the end, walked away whole.